What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of my favorite and least favorite things about the BLU F92e 5G to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about it, definitely check out the description, where I am linking to several other videos about the phone, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So to start off, my first pro for the BLU F92e 5G is the camera. Now with this phone, up front, we got a 13 megapixel selfie camera, then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 0.3 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, considering this is a phone you can get for less than $200, I do think we actually have a pretty nice camera here. While you may not be taking the most amazing studio quality photos, for more average casual use, say you're taking a couple Instagram photos here and there, or maybe stuff to send to friends and family, or even using something like Snapchat where the quality doesn't even matter. No matter what you're doing, if you are looking for a more affordable phone that can take some really nice photos, then I feel like you really won't be disappointed with this phone. To give you an idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the BLU F92e 5G. And again, considering this is a phone you can get for less than $200, I do think the photo quality is really good. In fact, honestly, for most people, for things you're typically going to be using a smartphone camera for, I really don't think you actually need a whole lot better than this. I mean, sure, on one hand, if you spend $1,000 on a flagship phone, it's obviously going to take much better photos than this. But for more casual daily use, I mean, if you post a photo like this on Instagram, I seriously doubt the difference is going to be immediately noticeable. So again, in general, while obviously you are going to want something a bit higher end if you're really into something like mobile photography, if you're more of a casual camera user and you are looking for a more affordable phone that can still take really good photos, then overall, I do think this phone will be a good choice. My second pro for the BLU F92e 5G is the storage. Now, for the price, the storage we're getting here is really impressive. This phone is getting 128 gigabytes of internal storage with micro SD card expansion. So yeah, this is definitely a lot of storage, and I feel like for the average user, this is really all you're gonna need. Sure, if you're someone who's constantly downloading apps and games and stuff like that, then you will probably want even more storage than this. But again, for the average user, for the person who's typically looking for a phone in this price range, 128 gigabytes is really gonna be plenty. My third pro for the BLU F92e 5G is the processor. Now with this phone, we're getting 4 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. Now on one hand, this is definitely not a new processor at all. In fact, I want to say for at least half of the 5G phones in this price range, they all have pretty much this processor. But that being said, for what it is, the MediaTek Dimensity 700 is definitely a really good processor, and for more basic activities like web browsing, social media, watching videos here and there, and listening to music and stuff like that, while it's not really lightning fast or anything, I do think you will get a pretty good experience. In addition to this, of course, as the name of the phone suggests, the BLU F92e 5G is in fact a 5G phone, and while even at this point in 2023, 5G isn't exactly necessary, this phone is a perfect example of how 5G phones are really becoming more and more affordable, to the point where if you're going through the trouble of getting a new phone anyway, you might as well get a 5G phone, because after all, that's really the future. So you don't want to have a 4G phone and suddenly a few years down the road, maybe 4G really starts to get phased out, then you're gonna have to eventually get a 5G phone anyway. So the point is, seeing a phone that's this affordable, that also does have 5G connectivity and pretty good performance too, is definitely great to see, and I feel like it really does make this phone worth considering. My fourth pro for the BLU F92e 5G is the materials. Now with this phone, we are getting a pretty generic low-end phone design with a slightly thicker bottom bezel and the water drop notch front-facing camera, so really compared to the average phone in this price range, it doesn't really look any different. But that being said, when it comes to the actual materials, it's definitely a different story. With this phone, we actually have a matte glass on the back, and the sides are made of aluminum, and considering that most phones in this price range are made entirely of plastic, the BLU F92e 5G definitely does feel quite a bit more premium. In addition to this, the phone does have a pretty good amount of weight to it. It also has really solid buttons and good build quality all around. And while of course a lot of people are going to be using a case anyway, so it might not be that noticeable to everyone, having good build quality and solid materials is always a good thing. So if you are looking for that in a phone, then the BLU F92e 5G is going to be a great choice. And then my fifth pro for this phone is the battery. With the BLU F92e 5G, we're getting a 5000 mAh battery that supports 10-watt fast charging. So while the fast charging isn't the best in the world, for an entry-level phone like this, it's about average, and in my experience, while it doesn't charge lightning fast or anything, the charging speed for most people is going to be pretty decent. And then when it comes to the battery size, that's really the best thing here. With the 5000 mAh battery, in the US at least, that's pretty much the largest battery you can get in a phone. So if you're in a situation where maybe you're not always around a charger, but you still need to use your phone all day, obviously then you're going to want really good battery life. And with a 5000 mAh battery, that's something this phone definitely has. In addition to this, down the road as the battery degrades, which of course all batteries do, with a 5000 mAh battery as opposed to like a 3000 mAh battery, battery. Over time, it's definitely not going to wear out nearly as quickly. So if you like to get one phone and keep it for a longer time without having to replace it, then a phone like this that has a really large battery is going to be great for that too. But now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's talk about some drawbacks. So my first con for the BLU F92e 5G is the software. So with this phone, we do unfortunately only have Android 12. And while on one hand, I feel like most phones in this price range, even at this point, 4 months into the year, still do only have Android 12 too. Regardless, it is 2023 and we are on Android 13 now. So it would have been nice to see a new phone that actually came out this year also get the newest version of Android. And to make things worse, knowing how BLU's software support typically is, I honestly doubt this phone is actually going to get an update to Android 13 ever. And while again, at this point at least, Android 12 is still at least I guess decently newer, just keep in mind if you do get this phone, you are going to have to be okay with pretty much being stuck on Android 12 for the time you have it. My second con for the BLU F92e 5G is that it doesn't have NFC. Now, in case you don't know what this means, NFC is the main technology behind contactless mobile payment services. So if you like to use tap and pay, you will need a phone with NFC to do that. And unfortunately, since the BLU F92e 5G doesn't have NFC, you won't be able to do this. And at this point in 2023, with tap and pay becoming so popular and widely used, I feel like honestly every new phone, especially 5G phones, should have NFC. And for that matter, in most cases, I want to say maybe not every phone under $200, but a good amount of them do have NFC. So if you really want a phone that has that feature, then you can easily find something other than this phone that's honestly probably just as good that does actually have NFC. So NFC is definitely a feature BLU really shouldn't have left out. But then again, of course, if you don't use tap and pay and you don't ever see yourself using it in the future, this is obviously not going to matter at all. But just know, if you do use tap and pay, or maybe you do want to try it eventually, you're probably not going to want this phone because again, this phone does not have NFC. My third con for the BLU F92e 5G is the 720p resolution. Now with this phone, we're getting a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 270, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. So don't get me wrong, this display is definitely not all bad. In fact, aside from the resolution, I feel like everything else is actually pretty good. At 6.5 inches, maybe it's not the largest display out there, but it's definitely large enough to give most people a pretty good experience. Aside from the actual resolution, the colors and brightness also look pretty good. The viewing angles for being an IPS LCD are pretty decent too. And with a 20:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a pretty tall and narrow form factor. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, you'll get a pretty immersive experience. And if you're doing something like reading, browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, with this kind of form factor, you can fit a good amount of content on the screen without having to scroll too much. But that being said, with a 720p resolution, especially when you're doing things like watching videos where the image quality is a bit more important, you really can tell there definitely is a difference despite not looking terrible. The image is not the sharpest. So if you are in that situation where you're really consuming a lot of content and you want a really nice looking image, then most likely you will be better off with a phone that has a 1080p resolution instead. My fourth con for the BLU F92e 5G is that it doesn't have an ultra-wide camera. Now, this is kind of a weird one because on BLU's website, it says it does have an ultra-wide camera, but I for the life of me couldn't find it. And even if it does have a secret feature somewhere, the fact that I as a tech reviewer couldn't find it just goes to show that even if it is there somewhere, it's definitely not user-friendly at all. I mean, looking at the camera app, in any phone I've ever used that has an ultra-wide camera, usually you'll be able to tap pretty much right here, and it'll zoom out to 0.5x or whatever it might be. But as you can see, that feature doesn't happen, and even if I try to zoom out, it just doesn't work. But then on the other hand, here's the Samsung Galaxy A54 5G for example. As you can see, this phone absolutely does have an ultra-wide camera, 0.5 right here, tap on this. And as you can see, the angle is quite a bit wider. So I personally couldn't find the ultra-wide camera on this phone, and even if it is somewhere, it's definitely not user-friendly at all. So if you do like to take a lot of pictures and you want to get those wider angles, then keep in mind, this is probably not the best choice for you. And then finally, my fifth con for the BLU F92e 5G is that it doesn't have wireless charging. Now, really the main reason I bring this up is because the BLU F91 5G, which is, I guess, technically this phone's predecessor, does actually have wireless charging. So if you heard about that phone first, or maybe you haven't now, and you're expecting that this phone has that feature too, then keep in mind, unfortunately, the BLU F92e 5G does not have wireless charging. So if that feature is important to you, then you will be disappointed. But honestly, aside from that, in general, wireless charging really isn't a feature you commonly find in phones like this anyway. So it's not really that big a deal, but since the F91 5G did have it, it's kind of disappointing they took it away with this phone. But those were my pros and cons for the BLU F92e 5G. Again, if you do want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.